good evening, or perhaps good morning. Tonight, we are doing something a little different. We are going somewhere that most history books pass over with impressive speed. Not because the subject isn't genuinely significant, not because the people involved weren't real and complex and worthy of understanding, but because the subject matter is, to put it as delicately as possible, fragrant. The kind of history that sits in a corner of the past that polished academic writing tend to approach from a considerable distance, acknowledge briefly, and then move away from with the air of someone who has places to be. Tonight, we are spending an entire day, or rather, an entire night, because the nature of this particular life made nights the important thing. Living as a medieval gong farmer. Now, before you ask, because you are absolutely going to ask, a gong farmer is not someone who farms gongs. That would be a far stranger and rather more tranquil profession. No, a gong farmer, in medieval England and across much of Western Europe between roughly the 11th and 16th centuries, was a person responsible for cleaning out cesspits, privies, and sewage pits in the towns and cities of the age. They were the sanitation workers of their era, the people who descended into underground chambers by rope in the middle of the night and removed what generations of citizens had deposited there. They carried it away through the sleeping streets on heavy carts, transported it to the outskirts of the city, and ensured that the life of the urban population could continue functioning, which it absolutely could not without them. They were essential. They were economically well compensated. They were socially avoided, and they were forbidden in many towns, from so much as walking to the city's main streets in the hours of daylight. That last part is true, and we will get to it, and by the time we arrive there you will understand precisely why. Before we begin properly, if you are enjoying this already and you have not yet done so, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. This channel exists just because you keep watching, because you keep sharing it, and your subscription means more of this, more quiet evenings with history, more slow journeys through forgotten lives, more long and thoroughly unnecessary explorations of corners of the past that are absolutely worth visiting. It takes about 3 seconds. Somewhere in a medieval churchyard, a gong farmer who never made it into the history books will feel, however obscurely, that their life has been acknowledged. Also, I would genuinely love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city, your country, or simply the time where you are into the comments below. I always find it remarkable how far this reaches. There is something fitting about history being watched in the dark, across time zones, by people who simply needed something quiet to settle into. Now, dim the lights, if you haven't already. Settle back against whatever you have. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Let your jaw unclench. It's always clenched just a little, even when you think it isn't. Let your breathing slow itself to something more like its natural pace. Medieval England is waiting. It smells extraordinary. And we are going in. You wake up at dusk. This is the first strange thing, and it catches you every time, even after years. Not the smell. That comes later, and it comes with the absolute consistency of an old acquaintance you never sent for. No, the first strange thing is that you rise when the rest of the world is going to bed. While the city is packing itself away for the evening, while shutters are being drawn and fires banked and children herded off to their sleeping mats, and the last of the market stalls are folding their goods into sacks and baskets, and the taverns are filling with the early evening crowd, you are swinging your legs off the edge of your straw pallet and pressing your feet into the cold dirt floor. You have work to do. The year is somewhere in the middle of the 14th century. Let's say 1340. The city is London, though it could just as easily be York, Norwich, Bristol, or any of the dozens of English towns that have grown large enough, dense enough, and populated enough to have a serious and pressing problem with their own waste. You are, by the reckoning of the people around you, a gong farmer. The word itself carries more history than you might expect. Gong comes from the Old English word gang, which means, with an almost disarming simplicity, to go. The privy, the toilet, the place of relief, the spot in the yard or the room in the corner or the seat over the pit. It is, in the working language of several centuries of common English speech, simply the place where you go. And you are the person who farms what grows there, not the most romantic etymology in the historical record. But history stopped worrying about romance approximately 5 minutes after it started. You sit on the edge of your bed for a long moment, The room around you is dark in a particular way that medieval interiors get dark. Not the clean, total darkness of properly blacked out modern room, but layered and textured darkness full of information, if you know how to read it. The smell of the straw on the floor, the faint sweetness of old wood smoke embedded in every surface after years of the same open hearth, the smell of the people who sleep here, and beneath all of that, something else. Something that arrived with you every morning of the last several years, and that no amount of scrubbing has entirely persuaded out of the wood of the walls or the clay between the timbers. You have, over considerable time, mostly stopped noticing it. The room is a single room, or perhaps two, if things have gone reasonably well for you. Most gong farmers in a city like London occupied modest accommodations. Not out of penury, as we will come to understand, because penury was not the gong farmer's characteristic problem, but because the city's social geography had a way of suggesting and sometimes insisting where certain people ought to live, on the outskirts, close to the walls, in the neighborhoods where the tanneries clustered, where the slaughterhouses were, where the smell of industry was already dense enough in the air that one additional professional fragrance barely shifted the general balance. The city had arranged itself, over the centuries, according to a kind of practical hierarchy of smell. Your family occupies this space with you. Your wife, certainly. Children, if they have survived. And in 14th century England, the conditional tense in that sentence is doing serious work. Your eldest son is 12 and has begun coming along on simpler nights. He sleeps on now. You let him sleep. He will need everything he has. The light comes from a rushlight. This is a length of dried reed or rush, soaked in rendered animal fat, tallow, and burned on a simple iron holder. It gives just enough light to see your own hands by without quite being enough to see the expression on your face. And this may, on a work morning, be a kindness. Rushlights cost almost nothing to make. Tallow candles cost a little more and burn a little brighter. Beeswax candles cost considerably more and were used by people with considerably more to spend than a laboring family in the outer districts. You burn rushlights. They smell faintly of what they're soaked in. Everything smells of something. This is simply how the world is arranged. You swing yourself upright. The straw pallet crinkles beneath you with a slightly damp sound of straw that have been slept on for a long time and that will need replacing before another season is out. You stand. The cold floor meets your feet with an instant, flat, impartial chill that no amount of familiarity ever quite prevents you from noticing. Your work clothes are where they always are. And the work clothes deserve their own moment of attention because the gong farmer's relationship with clothing was, to choose the most honest word, negotiated. It was a settlement reached between practical necessity and the absence of any good solutions. The medieval gong farmer's wardrobe was divided, with absolute clarity, into two categories. There were work clothes, and there was everything else. The work clothes were put on now, in the cool and slightly smoky dark of the room, and the putting on of them had none of the freshness of getting dressed in the ordinary morning sense. It was more like resuming something. The garments had been worn so many times in such specific conditions that they had long since passed out of the category of clothing in any neutral sense, and into something more like a professional skin. They were dark, not originally, perhaps, but darkened through work and washing, and particular chemistry of repeated exposure to things your job exposed you to. They were stiff at the shoulders and soft at the knees. They had a weight to them that clean clothes don't have. The basic layer was linen, a coarse shirt, long-sleeved, falling to the thighs. Linen was a universal undergarment of medieval Europe for most social classes. It was more washable than wool, less itchy against the skin, and could be laundered regularly even when the outer garments were not. For a gong farmer, the linen shirt could be boiled clean, which was a practical consideration of some importance. It was stained with the particular stains of a working life in a working city, but it was clean in the way that mattered. Over the linen, wool, a tunic of thick, undyed will fall into mid-thigh, belted at the waist with a leather strap. The wool was hand-spun and hand-woven, as all medieval cloth was, and had the texture that resulted from that process, dense, slightly irregular, with a resistance to the touch that a modern textile industry would consider a significant quality defect, and that the medieval body simply accommodated over the years, developing calluses in the appropriate locations. Undyed wool was brown-gray in the way of the sheep it came from, a color that could be described charitably as earthy, and less charitably as already slightly dirty before it got dirty. Medieval wool clothing had a relationship with human skin that required commitment from both parties. Think of it as nature's version of sandpaper that eventually, after sufficient years of shared experience, evolved into something more like extremely coarse paper. Progress, of a kind, hose covered the legs. Stockings of woven wool rising from the feet to the upper thigh, attached to the belt by ties called points. In the more fashionable strata of 14th century society, hose were a notable article of vanity, tight-colored, sometimes elaborately decorated, and the subject of more commentary in period literature than you might expect. Yours were none of these things. They stayed up approximately as reliably as the laws of physics permitted. The boots were the real investment. Leather, calf-high, with a flat sole and no structural support in any sense that a modern podiatrist would recognize. They were greased regularly with animal fat to maintain their flexibility and water resistance. They were old enough to have shaped themselves to your feet. They were good boots, and the fact that you care about them in a way you didn't care about any other item of your work clothing said something about how much of your working night was spent on your feet, moving through dark streets, and how much having a good boot mattered under those conditions. What you did not have, and what would make a modern occupational health officer genuinely weep, was any protective equipment in the recognizable sense of that term. No gloves, no respirator or face covering beyond what your own sleeve could provide in extremity, no sealed protective suit, no goggles, no safety boots in the modern sense of reinforced toes and waterproof linings. Nothing. The concept of systematically designed protective equipment for workers in hazardous occupations was not a feature of the 14th century. What existed in its place was experience, accumulated practical, passed between workers over decades and generations, full of specific knowledge about how to manage the risks of the work without anyone having formalized it into a protocol. The hat deserves particular mention. Wide-brimmed leather, functional in a way that became apparent approximately the first time you worked beneath an open privy chute, without one, and then extremely apparent on every subsequent occasion. Medieval occupational headwear. Innovation driven by physics. Over everything in cold months, when a rough woolen cloak. You would be outside for most of the night. The city at night in mid-century England was not warm. Now you need to eat before you go. And the question of what a medieval gong farmer ate before a night's work is, in its way, as interesting as everything else. Breakfast, or rather, the evening meal before night's work, which occupied the functional role of breakfast in the reverse schedule you live by, was built around a small number of reliable foods that the medieval laboring diet depended on utterly. Bread, first of all, but not bread as a modern person means bread. Medieval bread, made in the lower reaches of the social and economic spectrum, was dense and dark and heavy in ways that the lightest modern artisanal loaf, nodding at medieval authenticity, does not genuinely approach. It was made from rye, barley, oats, or mixed grains. Wheat was expensive, and the fine white bread made from sieve wheat flour was a luxury of the wealthy that most ordinary people encountered, if they encountered at all, as a performance of status in someone else's house. Your bread was darker. It required serious commitment from your jaw. It was calorie-dense and filling in the manner of something that had spent its existence close to the earth and was in no hurry to let go. The bread was eaten alongside pottage. The word covers an enormous range of medieval cooking, from thick grain porridge to vegetable stew to something approaching an actual soup, depending on what was available and who was cooking. At its most basic and most common in poorer households, pottage was dried peas or beans boiled with water and salt into a thick paste, occasionally supplemented with root vegetables, onions, leeks, or, in better weeks, a piece of salt pork or a bit of dried fish. It tasted what it was, earnest, filling, and honest, if the person making it knew what they were doing, which medieval cooks generally did, having spent their entire culinary lives in the discipline of making limited ingredients perform as generously as possible. It was actually quite decent. You ate with ale. Always ale, not water, in the morning sense. Not because medieval people were all perpetually half drunk, though some period commentary would raise an eyebrow at that disclaimer, but because water was unreliable. The connection between contaminated water and illness was understood empirically, even without germ theory. People knew that certain wells made you sick. They knew the river was not to be trusted for drinking. Ale, brewed from grain through a process that happened to include sufficient heat to deal with the most dangerous inhabitants of unclean water, was safer. It was low in alcohol. Children drank it. Everyone drank it. You drank it now, by the light of the rushlight, at a table that was also a bench and sometimes a shelf, in a room full of the smells of domestic life. Your wife sat across from you. There was not much conversation. There rarely was at this hour, in this specific moment before you left. She knew where you were going the same way she knew where the sun went at night. Entirely, practically, and without any particular requirement for discussion. Your youngest child, a daughter, 4 years old, with that peculiar toddler quality of being able to sit in perfect stillness for minutes at a time and then move with inexplicable velocity, watched you from her corner with the round-eyed seriousness of a child processing something she hadn't quite filed yet. She had asked about your work before. She had received answers scale for her understanding. She accepted that her father cleaned the pits at night, in approximately the same way she accepted that bread came from baking and milk came from the goat. She had not yet learned that this information was supposed to be socially awkward. You finished your bowl. You wiped it with the last of the bread. You stood up, and your wife looked at you in the way she looked at you every evening, and you looked back, and the things that needed saying between two people who understood each other's lives were said in that particular silence that married people develop. You picked up your hat. But before we follow you out into the city, there's something we need to understand about the world you're about to walk into. Because medieval London, medieval any city of significant size, really, had a relationship with its own waste that was, if you approached it without modern context, startling in its ambition and deeply imperfect in its execution. Imagine the city from a distance first. From the south bank of the Thames, looking north, on a clear morning when the light is good, a line of buildings crowding toward the river, spires of churches visible above the general roofline, the stone towers of the Tower and the Palace complex at Westminster marking the eastern and western extremities of something that a visitor from rural England, arriving for first time, perhaps for a market day or a legal matter, might well stop and simply stare for a while. London in the middle decades of the 14th century held somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. The number was not fixed. It shifted across the century with plague, famine, economic expansion, and the great catastrophe of 1348 that we will discuss shortly. At its height before the Black Death, it was one of the largest cities in Northern Europe, a dense and complicated and genuinely impressive achievement of human communal organization. Now step into it. The streets were narrow, not narrow in the way of a charming European lane on a travel program, where the narrowness has been preserved for aesthetic reasons, and is actually quite pleasant. Narrow in the way of places where the geometry of daily movement required strangers to turn sideways when passing in opposite directions, where the overhanging upper stories of buildings on either side of the lane blocked the sky to a thin stripe, where the surface underfoot was a compressed mixture of packed earth, cobblestones in the better-maintained commercial areas, with chips from nearby workshops, straw spread to absorb mud and moisture, and the ambient accumulation of working cities. Daily production of organic waste. Medieval cities had no drainage system in the modern sense. What they had were drainage channels cut into the sides of streets, open gutters, roughly, intended to carry rainwater and general runoff toward the nearest river or the edge of the city. This system worked during heavy rain, when the rainfall volume itself helped carry things along. It worked considerably less well at other times, when the channels simply collected whatever was deposited in them and held it there until either rain came, someone cleaned it, or it overflowed into the street in a way that became impossible to ignore. The smell of a large medieval city was, by any standard a modern person carries, extraordinary. Not one smell, but an entire architecture of smells layered by district, by season, by the direction of the wind, and by the specific economic and social activities of each area. Near the river and the fish docks, a thick organic smell of moving water combined with the blood and salt of the fish trade, the sharp tang of tanneries that process hides with urine and bark, the smoke from river craft. In the commercial center, the competing smells of food stalls, meat on the grill, fresh bread, spices from the apothecaries, against the dusty grain smell of the cereal markets, the blood of the butcher's street, the sweet, sharp smell of tallow candles being made nearby. In the residential quarters, particularly the denser ones, wood smoke is a constant presence, the smell of cooking from 100 hearths, the animal smell of households that kept pigs and chickens and occasionally a cow in their yards or even their ground floors in winter. And underneath all of it, persistent and patient, the cesspits. Medieval London had thousands of them, beneath or beside every substantial building. Every house, every inn, every monastery, every merchant's hall, every church that had accommodation for priests or monks. Somewhere in the structure or the yard, there was a pit, a lined hole in the ground, designed to receive everything that the human body produced and to hold it contained and mostly covered until someone dealt with it. The cesspits were supposed to be dug a certain distance from wells. This regulation existed in various forms in various medieval city ordinances from the 13th century onward. It was sensible. It reflected an empirical understanding, accumulated through generations of observation, that wells located too close to waste pits tended to produce water that made people ill. The regulation was not consistently observed. Medieval building was pragmatic and often crowded, and the strict geometry of appropriate distances was a kind of principle that worked beautifully when you had space and ignored by necessity when you didn't. This inconsistency was not without consequence, as medieval physicians and the people who lived with those consequences both knew perfectly well. The cesspits needed to be emptied. They filled. They could not fill indefinitely. When they approached capacity, or when structural deterioration allowed contents to begin escaping in directions that were not planned, the problem became urgent. The smell, which was always present, became impossible. The risk of contaminating nearby wells or foundations increased. The practical functioning of the household above became compromised. And so word was sent to a gong farmer. That gong farmer, in the right year, in the right city, was you. Your tools are waiting. The gong farmer's toolkit was not an elaborate affair. It was a set of simple, durable, purpose-made implements that solved a specific problem using the most direct available means, and had probably looked more or less the same for several centuries, and would continue looking more or less the same for several more, because the problem it was designed to solve had not changed and would not change until cities developed entirely different approaches to sanitation. You had buckets, flat-bottomed wooden buckets, iron-banded at top and bottom, with a wooden handle, several of them, enough to keep the rhythm of the work going without losing time, which was, at the rates being charged and the hours being worked, a real economic consideration. The buckets were heavy even empty. Full, they were serious business. They had been cleaned after the last job, and they smelled, currently, of the particular faint residue that cleaning removes to approximately 85% completion. You had shovels, long-handled, broad-bladed, iron or iron tip, depending on what period and what budget. The shovel was, in terms of fundamental importance to the work, the thing. It was what gave you the ability to move material from where it was to where it needed to go, while maintaining enough physical distance from the process to make the work sustainable across a night. In a job where close proximity to unpleasant things was non-negotiable, a few additional feet of distance represented quality of life in a very real sense. You had rope, heavy hemp rope, coiled and draped over your shoulder, smelling of hemp and use. The rope was for jobs where the pit was deeper than standing arm's length could reach from above, which, in the case of a cesspit that had been filling for a decade or more, meant considerably deeper than you could work from the surface. Rope allowed descent. Rope also allowed hauling. A simple pulley arrangement rigged over the access hatch let you raise full buckets from the depths without the person below needing to lift them all the way to the surface by strength alone. A ladder. Not always, but often shorter pits, better access. There was a spectrum of entry methodology from lean over the edge with a long-handled shovel through descend on a rope to lower yourself on a rope and then work the ladder while someone manages things from above. Your experience with each approach was specific and practical. Shoulder yokes, wooden frames fitted across the upper back and shoulders, with hooks or notches from which two buckets could be suspended, one on each side. This was a medieval sanitation worker's standard transport method for moving filled buckets through the streets. Balance load across the back and shoulders, both hands free, the weight distributed in a way that a person of appropriate strength and the appropriate posture developed through years of exactly this use could manage across considerable distances and over the cobbled, uneven surfaces of a city street at midnight. A lantern. The work happened at night. The streets were dark. The pits were darker. An iron lantern with an oil wick and a horn or thin scraped bladder panel to protect the flame from wind, or failing that a simple rush torch, or both, light enough to see what you were doing, which was depending on the specific state of affairs in a given pit on a given night. Sometimes better than you might have hoped, and sometimes exactly as bad as you feared. That was the kit. Bucket, shovel, rope, yoke, light. No engineering advances. No novel technology. Just a direct application of human labor and simple mechanical advantage to a problem that was itself entirely unchanged from the problem your father faced and his father before him. And that would face the people who did this work for another 2 centuries until cities began developing different infrastructural responses. You pack what you need into the hand cart you share with your working companions. 2 other men, one younger than you and one considerably older, both of whom you have worked alongside long enough that the working relationship has settled into something efficient and largely wordless. You'll meet them at the cart. You'll exchange nods. The night will begin. You step out of the house into the street, and the city closes around you. The street that opens off your house was called something entirely unremarkable. A lane, a way, a gate. Medieval English street names were magnificently literal. Bread Street sold bread. Milk Street handled dairy. Honey Lane was for beekeepers and confectioners. Poultry was where the poultry sellers worked. And in the less glamorous districts of the city, other names to the same faithful job of description. Dunghill Lane, Stinking Lane, Pudding Lane. The word pudding being, in the medieval sense, a reference to the intestinal content of animals processed by butchers, which were collected and carried through that particular route. History street names were honest in ways that modern urban rebranding has mostly moved away from. Your own street sits in a district that the city's official documents would describe in terms of the ward it falls within, and that its residents would describe with a pragmatic geographical shorthand of people who know exactly where they are and don't need a literary framework for it. It is a working neighborhood. The smell tells you this immediately and continually. The city at night was a genuinely different world from the city by day. And this is not a metaphor deployed for atmospheric effect. It is a structural fact of medieval urban life. The concept of the curfew. The word comes from the French couvre-feu, to cover the fire, referring to the bell that signaled the closing hour after which fires were to be banked and honest people should be indoors, was a real and enforced feature of medieval city governance. Being out after curfew, without legitimate purpose or specific permission, was not a neutral act. It was a kind of act that attracted the attention of the night watch, which was the city's nocturnal enforcement presence. Men employed to walk the streets between roughly 9 in the evening and sunrise, challenging anyone they encountered and deal with those who couldn't account for themselves satisfactorily. Gong farmers had specific authority to be out. This was written into the ordinances that regulated their work. In London, the hours were 9 in the evening to 5 in the morning, and these hours were both a permission and a restriction. Work within them, legal, necessary, authorized. Work outside them, especially work in the hours when the city was going about its daytime business and the general public was present and the streets were full, was another matter entirely, involving fines and official disapproval of a specific and pointed kind. The nighttime-only rule was social rather than technical in its reasoning. The work of the gong farmer was necessary. This was universally acknowledged, in an implicit way that medieval cities acknowledged things they needed but preferred not to discuss in polite company. But the city's merchants and citizens and office holders were not interested in watching it happen. The work could be done. It simply had to be done where no one respectable could see it, smell it more than they already did, or be required to integrate it into their daytime experience of the city as a place of commerce and culture and Christian civilization. The nighttime restriction allowed the city to have its sanitation and maintain its dignity. By morning, things were as they were going to be, and whatever had been done in the dark could be absorbed into the general texture of urban life without requiring explicit acknowledgement. You walked through this dark city with your lantern, your tools, and the specific physical confidence of someone who had made this walk hundreds of times, and who knew the city in a particular way that nocturnal workers know it, by its sounds and its smells and its textures underfoot, rather than by its visual surface. The cobblestones were wet from earlier rain. The gutter channels ran with a thin, slow trickle. The shadows between buildings were deep and absolute, and you moved through them with the ease of someone who had long since stopped finding darkness an obstacle. The night watch nodded as you passed one of their number on the main road. He knew you. You knew him. The exchange required no words, only the mutual recognition of people conducting their respective nighttime businesses with appropriate legitimacy. Ahead, the cart. Your older companion had arrived first and was already settling the horse, running a hand along the animal's flank in the way you did with a horse you've been working with for years. The younger man appeared from the side lane a moment later, yoke over his shoulder. No ceremony. The night started the way it always started. The horse moved. The cart rolled. The lantern swayed at the front of the cart with the gentle, pendulum patience of something that has accepted its situation. First job, an inn on the far side of the market. Word had come a week ago that the pit was getting full. You knew this pit. You'd worked it years before, when it was perhaps half what it would be tonight. These things moved in cycles, like everything else. The same pits, the same customers, every few years. Medieval cesspits, well-built and properly sized, could hold a remarkable volume of material before they genuinely needed intervention. The inn's pit was soundly constructed, stone-lined, properly covered, and had been holding without incident since your last visit, which said something about both the quality of the masonry and the patience of the innkeeper. The capacity of well-built medieval cesspits was one of the genuinely surprising facts of medieval sanitation history. Archaeological excavations across England have unearthed cesspit chambers that are architectural achievements in miniature. Vaulted stone rooms, corbelled ceilings, well-laid brick lining, drainage channels, ventilation. The idea that a medieval privy was simply a rough hole in the ground is a myth that the actual excavated evidence comprehensively contradicts, at least for the better-built examples. Some of the larger cesspit chambers discovered beneath medieval urban sites in London, York, Winchester, and other English cities were large enough to stand in and show evidence of multiple phases of construction over decades. The finest examples, those serving monasteries, great merchant houses, or civic institutions, were built to last and built to function, because the alternatives to them functioning were, in the most immediate and practical sense, intolerable. But before we descend into the pit itself, we should spend a moment understanding what, exactly, these underground chambers contained and what they represented, both to the people who built them and to the historians and archaeologists who have spent the last century being very interested in them for reasons that are entirely professional. A medieval cesspit was, at its most fundamental, a lined underground chamber designed to receive and hold human waste from a privy or privies above it. The design spectrum was wide. At the basic end, a pit dug into earth, perhaps lined with wooden planks or wattled to slow the seepage of liquids into surrounding soil, covered with boards or stone. At the advanced end, a fully vaulted chamber with stone or brick walls and floor, a corbelled or arched ceiling, ventilation channels, and a construction quality that would survive for centuries, and in many cases has. The best-built medieval cesspits were remarkable things, and the remarkable thing about them is partly visible to us today, because of what happened inside them over the years. The anaerobic environment of a sealed cesspit, low oxygen, high ammonia, chemically hostile to aerobic bacteria, is, from a materials preservation standpoint, almost ideal. Organic material that would decompose rapidly on the surface can be preserved in a cesspit for centuries. Leather, textile fibers, wood, seeds, plant material, animal remains, food waste, parasitic eggs. All of these can survive in cesspit deposits in ways they cannot survive in ordinary soil. Archaeologists, when they excavate medieval cesspits, find them extraordinarily valuable for this reason. The Jorvik Viking Center in York is partly built on the evidence recovered from the cesspits and cesslayer deposits of the Viking Age and medieval city. The personal items, food remains, craft debris, and biological material recovered from these deposits have provided a window into daily life that no chronicle or official document could have given us. What people ate, what parasites they carried, what they wore, what they accidentally dropped or deliberately disposed of. Coins appear with some regularity. Rings, too. Keys. Small religious medals. Pieces of pottery. The occasional item of clothing. Objects lost to the privy opening above, sometimes accidentally and sometimes a way that suggests the depositor had decided that certain items were better at the bottom of a cesspit than anywhere else, which tells its own story about medieval life and the things people needed to hide. For you, standing above the inn's pit on a cold night in the 1340s, the archaeological significance of all of this is somewhat beside the point. What matters from your professional perspective is the following. The pit is a chamber of uncertain depth, somewhere between 8 and 12 feet, with walls that were solid the last time you were in it, and which you'll need to confirm haven't cracked in the intervening years. It has an access hatch, wooden board set flush with the yard surface, which you'll lift. It has a privy chute descending from above, sealed for tonight, and it has a floor somewhere down there that is covered to a depth you'll assess once you get the hatch open and the light down. The smell, when you lift the access boards, is precisely what it is. Medieval medical theory would have called it miasma. Corrupt air, the carrier disease, the foul exhalation of a place where death and putrefaction concentrated. This theory was incorrect in its mechanism. The actual causes of most diseases associated with such environments are microorganisms, not smells, but correct in its directionality, since the places that produced these smells were genuinely dangerous places that produced genuine illness. The miasma theory was wrong about the why, but right about the where. What you have developed, through years of doing exactly this, is a body that processes the initial impact of a pit's opening differently from how a first exposure would process it. There is still a physical response. The throat narrows slightly, the eyes water briefly, but your body moves through it in seconds now and returns to functional equilibrium. Experience is a profound physiological teacher. You lower the lantern first. Always. The light descends on its rope into the chamber below, and you watch it as it goes. If the flame flickers and goes out before the lantern reaches the floor, you stop and wait. You know what this means. Methane, or another oxygen-displacing gas produced by the decomposition in the chamber, has accumulated to a level that will not sustain combustion. This means it will not sustain you, either. This is not theoretical. There are records of gong farmers who did not wait for the flame test, and who are noted in the historical record only because someone eventually had to deal with the consequences. Tonight, the flame stays lit. You look down into the circle of lamplight. Right? Time to begin. The actual mechanics of cleaning a medieval cesspit were both simpler and more exhausting than they sound, which is a sentence worth sitting with for a moment because they already sound fairly exhausting. The process was assessment first. Before anything else, you needed to understand what you were working with tonight. Depth of material, current state of the walls and floor, accessibility through the hatch, consistency of what you'd be moving. A pit that had been filling for 18 months looked different from one that hadn't seen attention in 10 years. A pit in sound structural condition was a different night's work from one where the walls had shifted or the ceiling had developed cracks that suggested the masonry was no longer uniformly committed to maintaining the integrity of the chamber. You'd worked both kinds. You knew the difference, and knowing the difference was part of the skill. Tonight's pit at the inn was manageable, well-built, solidly walled, with about 10 feet of depth to the hatch and the material level perhaps 2 feet below that. Full, in other words, but not overflowing, which meant someone at the inn had kept track of things and called you before the situation became emergency management. Not everyone did this. Some pits you have been called to because the situation had passed through the stage of concerning and arrived directly at the stage of immediate structural and sanitary crisis, and those nights were considerably harder and commanded considerably higher rates. Your companion went down first, older, more experienced in the descent, moving down the rope with the efficient absence of drama that distinguished someone who had made this particular kind of entry hundreds of times from someone who had made it fewer. You heard the settled quiet of a man finding his footing in the chamber below, the small sounds of him locating the shovel and bucket that had been lowered ahead of him. From the surface, you managed the hauling rig, a simple block arrangement set over the hatch opening that multiplied your pulling force enough to make raising a full bucket manageable rather than heroic. Your third companion was at the cart with the horse, managing the surface transport, receiving filled buckets from you as you hauled them up, loading the material into the cart in the careful, even way that kept the load distributed and the cart stable. The choreography of a well-practiced team was one of the quieter satisfactions of the work. You've been operating together long enough that the whole system moved with almost no direction required. Bucket down, fill below. Hauled up, transferred, bucket down again. The rhythm established itself in the first few minutes of a job and then carried the night the way a current carries a boat. Not effortlessly, because there was no element of effortlessness about any of this, but with a functional momentum that made the hours pass in a way that purely exhausting work without rhythm does not. Down in the chamber, the work of confined, dimly lit, and physically demanding in the specific way that working in a small space with a shovel has always been physically demanding. Not complex work, in terms of cognitive load, but requiring a particular economy of movement. No wasted effort, no excess motion, no filling the bucket beyond what could be hauled without straining the rig. That came from experience rather than instruction. Medieval commentators who wrote about gong farmers described them, when they wrote about them at all, with a mixture of distaste and reluctant acknowledgement. Foul labor was a common characterization, the vilest of works. These descriptions were accurate in the strictly sensory sense. They missed something important. What they missed was that the work required genuine skill, not just physical capability, though that was certainly required, but the specific learned competence of managing equipment in a confined space, of assessing structural integrity and working conditions, of managing the logistics of moving significant volumes of material through dark city streets on a time-restricted schedule, while coordinating a small team and maintaining the kind of client relationships that kept the contracts coming year after year. These were real capabilities. They had real value. The fact that the work was simultaneously unpleasant in sensory terms does not diminish the skill any more than the unpleasantness of a surgeon's work diminishes the skill required to be a surgeon. The people who did the work were not unfortunate laborers without options. They were specialists in a specific and necessary trade. About halfway through the third bucket, with the rhythm established and the lantern casting its steady amber circle into the chamber below and the night settled into its working pace, your companion below called up something. Not an alarm. The tone was matter-of-fact. He'd found something. A small coin, probably, or something else. These discoveries happened. People dropped things through privy openings over decades of use. Coins that slipped from fingers, small personal items, objects lost in the dark. Occasionally something more interesting. A ring, a key, a small carved figurine found once memorably that had no obvious explanation for being in a cesspit, but was there nonetheless. You kept what you found. There was no system of archaeological salvage in 1340. You kept it, and it went in the belt pouch, and it was additional income of an unscheduled kind. Tonight, it was a small coin. It came up in the next bucket. You pocketed it without ceremony. Bucket, shovel, rope, yoke, light. One more. Not all the work was in-yard cesspits on the straightforward model. Some nights. And these nights came at their own pace, governed by the needs of the larger institutions of the city. The job took you somewhere more architecturally complicated. Somewhere that presented its own specific geometry of access and challenge, and that rewarded those challenges with appropriately elevated payment. Castles and great houses had their own arrangements. The garderobe was a standard toilet fixture of the medieval castle and substantial manor house. The word itself is French. It means, with a wonderful literalness, guard the robe. The reason for this name is that while clothing was traditionally stored in or near the garderobe chamber, because the ammonia-laden atmosphere was believed to deter moths from nesting in the fabric. Whether this worked in practice is a question with a genuinely mixed historical answer. Whether clothing stored in a garderobe smelled like a garderobe afterward is a question with more consistent one. The architecture of the garderobe was a specific achievement of medieval domestic engineering. A small stone chamber, typically projecting outward from the main wall of the castle or great house at one of the upper floors, constructed above a shaft that ran down to the thickness of the wall, ending either in a cesspit chamber at the base of the structure or in an open discharge point. Sometimes over a moat, sometimes over a steep hillside or cliff, sometimes above a river or stream that served as a convenient disposal route. The castles that discharge directly into their own moats are worth considering from the perspective of military architecture, because you had on one hand a moat specifically designed to make entry into the castle difficult and discourage attackers, and on the other hand a constant supplemental contribution to the moat's contents from the castle's garderobe chutes operating above. Military historians of the medieval period do not typically dwell on this aspect of castle design. The reasons for this restraint are understandable. Cleaning a garderobe chute, or more precisely, cleaning the cesspit at the base of a garderobe chute, or removing the accumulated material from the shaft itself, was technically more demanding than cleaning a standard townhouse pit. The shaft was narrow. You were working through a passage cut through several feet of stone, sometimes angled and sometimes vertical, with dimensions calibrated for the original purpose and not for someone trying to maneuver a bucket and shovel inside it. Access from below through the outer wall opening was one approach. Access from above through the garderobe chamber itself was another. Neither was spacious. When you work for a great household, and this happened because the great households needed gong farmers as much as anyone else did, and the records of their household accounts confirm this with a matter-of-fact pragmatism of people noting that sewage management was a recurring expense, right alongside food and fuel and candles. You entered property through whatever entry was designated for the purpose. The servant's entrance, usually, the side door, the gate that led to the back of the property where the kitchen waste went and the animals were kept. You did not interact with the household any more than was strictly necessary. You did not admire the furnishings or the tapestries or the windows. You did your work. You were paid at the rate agreed in advance, and you left. The social geography of a great medieval household maintained clear and understood distinctions between those who lived within it, those who served it in regular capacities, and those who were brought in for specific necessary functions that the household needed, but that it preferred to keep conceptually at a distance. You occupied the third category. Everyone understood this, and the understanding was neither hostile nor particularly uncomfortable. It was simply the way that a hierarchical society organized the reality of its own physical needs. What you could observe, working in these places, was that wealth and bodily reality had a complicated relationship. The grandest castle in England had the same biological requirements as the humblest cottage. What varied was the distance the architecture maintained between the requirement and its consequences. A great lord's garderobe placed several feet of stone, a descending shaft, and a sealed chamber between the lord and the outcome of his daily existence. The outcome still existed. You were the one who dealt with it. There was something almost philosophical in this, considered from a sufficient distance. The architecture of wealth was, in part, an architecture of distance, from smells, from decay, from the daily realities of the body. The gong farmer's work existed in the space created by that distance. The payment for castle or great house work was meaningfully better than for standard urban cesspit work. You were there because you could do what was needed and because not many people could, and the pricing reflected that. Here is the part of this history that consistently surprises people who hear it for the first time. Medieval gong farmers were not poor. This statement requires context, because not poor in 14th century England means something quite different from what it means in any modern frame of reference. But by the actual standards of medieval laboring life, which were the only applicable standards, gong farmers occupied an economic position that was substantially better than most of their contemporaries in manual trades. A day laborer in 14th century England, someone hired for farm work, construction, loading and carrying, the general category of unskilled physical work, earned in the range of 1 to 3 pennies per day. This varied with time, location, season, and the prevailing labor market conditions, but it provides a working baseline. Skilled craftsmen, carpenters, masons, smiths, people whose work required significant training and specific expertise, earn considerably more, perhaps 4 to 8 pennies per day or more, depending on the craft and the period. Gong farmers earned more than this. Contemporary records, the household accounts of monasteries and great houses, city financial records, the occasional legal document, include payments to gong farmers that, when calculated on a per-night basis, significantly exceed the daily wages of most comparable workers. Payment was typically by volume, a figure per ton or per cartload of material removed, and a competent team working through a productive night could move multiple cartloads from a large, full cesspit. The rate per ton, multiplied by the volume of a full night's work, produced a nightly income that was several times what a day labor earned in a day and competitive with what a skilled craftsman earned in the same period. For emergency work, a cesspit that had overfilled and was creating an immediate problem for the household above it, the rates went higher still. The supply of people willing and able to deal with an emergency cesspit overflow was limited enough that the person who could deal with it could charge accordingly. The economics were straightforward, if you thought about them without flinching. The demand was absolute and inescapable. Every household in every city produced waste, all the time, without exception or vacation, and the cesspits filled on a schedule that could be managed but could not be suspended. The supply of workers was severely constrained by the nature of the work. In any market where demand is high and supply is low, price goes up. This principle has functioned with perfect consistency across all of human economic history, and the medieval sewage management sector was no exception to it. What this meant in practice was that a gong farmer who worked consistently, who maintained good professional relationships with reliable clients, who managed the logistics of the operation competently, and who did not succumb to the various risks of the profession, which were real, as we will discuss, could accumulate savings at a rate that most of his neighbors would have found remarkable and somewhat incongruous. Some gong farmers became employers. The more ambitious operators in a city like medieval London employed multiple workers under their direction, handling several jobs simultaneously, building up client lists that included monasteries, inns, merchant households, and city institutions, developing something that functioned economically as a small service business, even if it had none of the formal legal apparatus that a modern business would require. The scale of some of these operations, suggested by the occasional record that survives. One London record mentions a gong farming operation employing 13 workers simultaneously, implies an organizational sophistication that the occupational stereotype does not normally suggest. 13 workers, all operating at night, all in the same trade. That is a meaningful enterprise by any standard of the 14th century. The money was real. The social situation, however, was its own distinct territory. The social position of a medieval gong farmer was a study in the kind of contradiction that medieval society was extremely good at producing and extremely reluctant to acknowledge. On the economic axis, well compensated, sometimes substantially so, in a way that allowed for genuine material stability and occasionally genuine prosperity. On the social axis, marginal in ways that were enforced through a combination of custom, occasional law, and the ambient social pressure of a hierarchical world that had strong opinions about which kinds of work conferred dignity and which kinds did not. The contradiction between these two positions, prosperous but stigmatized, essential but invisible, necessary by night and unwelcome by day, was something that the individual gong farmer navigated as a daily feature of their existence. Not through some grand social protest or formal assertion of rights, but through the small, practical negotiations of ordinary life. Where you lived, whom you married, how you moved through the city, what community you built and participated in. Marriage, for a gong farmer, happened within the same general social world that all working-class marriage in medieval England happened within. It was not primarily a romantic institution in the modern sense, though romantic attachment was certainly possible and probably common. It was a legal and economic partnership, a social arrangement that formalized a combination of two people's resources and capacities for the purpose of establishing and maintaining a household and raising children to adulthood, which was its own considerable challenge. A gong farmer's wife came from the same stratum of the city, the working districts, the trade families, the world of people whose lives were organized around physical work and practical economy. A butcher's daughter, perhaps, or a tanner's widow, or the daughter of a man who ran one of the many small working enterprises that occupied the city's outer districts. These were people for whom a gong farmer's income was not unwelcome, and for whom the social stigma attached to his occupation was something to be weighed against the material stability it provided. In the manner of any practical decision made in a world where practical considerations were primary, the smell was, presumably, discussed at some point in the courtship process. Medieval people were nothing if not pragmatic. The wife of a gong farmer managed a household economy, a significant and genuine responsibility in a world where everything from food storage to clothing production to the management of whatever small animals a household kept required specific knowledge and constant attention. She may well have contributed to the business itself, in ways that historical record captures only obliquely. Women worked in the broader sanitation trades of medieval cities as rakers, street cleaners, in various waste management roles that the records note without dwelling on, and the line between managing a household's waste and participating in the trade of managing waste professionally was not always bright. Children in a Gong farmer's household grew up knowing what their family's work was. In a world where trades were typically passed from parent to child, the children of a Gong farmer were realistic candidates for the same profession. Some went that way. Others, particularly those whose parents had accumulated enough to finance it, apprenticed into other trades, smithing, tailoring, brewing, any of the dozens of craft and service occupations that the city's economy needed and that carried a different social valuation. This was one of the mechanisms of medieval social mobility. The economically successful low-status occupation that funded entry into a higher status one in the next generation. The community of Gong farmers in a city like London was small enough that everyone knew everyone else. The same small circle of nighttime workers, the same routes, the same clients, the same years of shared professional experience. Competition existed, but so did cooperation. Information about difficult jobs, about clients who paid promptly or who didn't, about structural problems with particular pits, was the kind of thing that a small professional community shared because it was useful to everyone. You had your people. In a society that preferred to pretend you didn't exist during daylight hours, your people were the ones who understood exactly what you were doing in the dark. Moving through the medieval city in the nighttime hours meant existing in a world that was, in every meaningful sense, different from the world of the day. Different population, different rules, different dynamics, different sounds and smells and social physics. The night watch were the official presences already discussed. They were the authorized nighttime population of the city, and they knew you. The relationship was professional rather than personal, a recognition between people conducting their respective legitimate nighttime businesses. You acknowledged each other, you didn't obstruct each other, and you moved on. Beyond the watch, the nighttime city had its own community of people who operated in darkness for their own reasons. Some were entirely legitimate. The bakers whose ovens needed to be firing well before dawn to have bread ready for the morning market. The brewers whose processes required early hours. The people who traveled at night for distance or safety or scheduling reasons. Others occupied more ambiguous territory. The medieval city after dark was where certain transactions happened that preferred darkness, exchanges of goods that weren't quite what the daylight economy would have permitted, conversations that needed to happen away from witnesses, the occasional resolution of disputes that had been building since afternoon and were reaching a conclusion now in a darkened lane with whatever instruments seemed appropriate. A Gong farmer, moving through this world with his lantern and his cart and his very specific tools and his professional smell, was an unusual figure in any of these nocturnal contexts, not a typical target for crime. There was nothing on or about him that was obviously worth taking, and the occupational smell created a perimeter of sorts, not a threat to anyone conducting their own quiet business. Simply a working man, going about the city's most essential and least elegant function with the matter-of-fact competence of a professional. On cold nights, the work was slower and the stone walls of the pits colder to the touch and the material in the chambers slightly different in texture. Colder temperatures affected the whole chemistry of what sat in the cesspit, as any experienced practitioner knew. On hot summer nights, the thermodynamics operated in entirely the opposite direction, making the work quicker in some respects and substantially worse in every other. Summer was high season for Gong farmers in the most commercially significant sense. The urgency of full cesspits in warm weather drove demand, which drove prices, which compensated to some degree for the additional unpleasantness of the ambient conditions. The horse at the cart became, over years of this work, a kind of fixed point in the night. Animals developed their own understanding of routines, and this horse had long since reached an accommodation with the specifics of its working life. The nighttime hours, the particular load, the particular smells, the familiar route to the lay stall. It stood in the street with the patient philosophical acceptance of a large domestic animal that has made peace with its situation. You appreciated this about the horse more than you would easily have admitted. The city breathed around you as the work went on. The glow of a baker's early fire, already warming an oven down a side street. A dog, somewhere that couldn't decide whether to bark. Water running from a conduit pipe into a trough. The sound of it clear and cold in the still air. A baby, in one of the buildings above the lane, finding its nighttime opinion emphatically. The creak of a sign and the occasional small wind that came off the river and moved through the streets before it stopped. These were the sounds of the city being itself, at the hour when it was most its own thing, without the performance of daytime commerce and social life layered over it. The church was, in medieval England, not simply an institution or a Sunday activity. It was a framework within which daily life was organized. The bells that told you the hour, the calendar that structured the year around feast and fast, the sacraments that marked every threshold of human existence from birth to death, the theological framework that explained what life was for and how it was meant to be lived. To be alive in 14th century England was to exist inside a pervasive and comprehensive religious architecture that had no equivalent in the secular modern world. For a gong farmer, the relationship with this architecture was particular. The church had well-developed theological opinions about purity and impurity. Not just the moral impurity of sin, but more ambient concept of cleanness and uncleanness that had roots going back through patristic tradition into the Hebrew scriptures and the Roman world. Certain things were ritually unclean. Certain occupations that involved regular contact with bodily waste, decay, or the products of death occupied a complex position in this theology. Necessary, yes, and not explicitly condemned, but marked in ways that created a social register that everyone could read. The occupations that touched the unclean things, butchers, tanners, and gong farmers among them, existed in a social space that the church had designated as necessary, but adjacent to something uncomfortable. They were not excommunicated. They were not denied the sacraments. But the broader cultural messaging of the medieval church's purity theology created an ambient sense that these workers occupied the lower registers of the dignity spectrum. What is historically interesting is how the church and its institutions handled the practical consequences of this theology when they needed gong farmers themselves. The monastery, the cathedral chapter, the great ecclesiastical institution. These places had cesspits just like everyone else, and those cesspits needed cleaning just like everyone else's, and the relevant household accounts record the payments to gong farmers with a completely practical tone that suggests the monks did not allow their theology of purity to interfere with their management of their own sanitation. This is a kind of pragmatism that history tends to present as hypocrisy, but that is probably more accurately understood as the necessary accommodation of abstract principle to concrete reality. The abstract principle said that contact with these things was somehow lesser. The concrete reality said that someone had to do it. The monastery's pit was full, and here was the appropriate payment for the job. Gong farmers attended church. They were baptized, confirmed, married, and buried by the same clergy who might have theoretical reservations about the implications of their occupation. They confessed. They observed the fasts and the feasts. They paid their tithes. They participated in the religious life of their communities because this was simply what you did when you were a Christian in medieval England, which you were, because it was not an optional identity. The theology also provided resources for making sense of one's position. Medieval Christianity had developed extensive frameworks for understanding earthly low status and hard work as spiritually meritorious. The idea that the humble and the lowly might be honored in the kingdom of heaven, that faithful labor regardless of its dignity in earthly terms was pleasing to God, that the body's necessities were not occasions for shame, but simply facts of mortal life shared equally by all humanity. These were genuine theological resources, and people used them. They were not simply rhetoric. They were frameworks for finding meaning in circumstances that the secular world offered limited acknowledgement of. The priest in your parish was a practical man, and kind. He never made anything particular of your occupation in the context of your dealings with him. Your baptism, your confession, your child's baptism, eventually your burial. All conducted with the same care he extended to the merchant on the better street and the laborer on the worse one. That mattered. In a world that often preferred to look past you, the equal extension of spiritual acknowledgement was not nothing. Medieval English cities regulated their sanitation with a genuine, if imperfect, seriousness. The official documents bear this out. There were laws, there were ordinances, there were periodic reissues of those laws when the existing ones had been ignored long enough to require restating, and there were specific provisions about gong farmers that gave them both authorization and restriction. The authorization was a nighttime permission already discussed. The restriction was the same regulation's other phase. Work only at night, work only in specified ways, take material only to designated places. The fines for violations were real. Working during daylight hours in London carried a 2-shilling penalty, significant enough to be a genuine deterrent, since it represented several nights' income even for a reasonably successful operator, without being ruinous enough to be confiscatory. Dumping material in unauthorized locations, in the river, in the streets, in any of the places the city specifically prohibited, carried its own penalties, also financial, also real. City ordinances about sanitation generally were remarkably detailed and remarkably persistent. London issued ordinances about street cleaning, about the disposal of butcher's waste, about the management of cesspits near wells and water supplies, about the responsibilities of householders for the condition of the street in front of their properties, all across the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. These ordinances were reissued frequently enough that historians have concluded, fairly reasonably, that they were imperfectly observed. People do not repeatedly reissue a law that is being universally obeyed. The legal framework also created a space where gong farmers could appear in a historical record in ways they otherwise did not. Legal disputes about payment, about working rights, about responsibility for damage caused during the course of work, about the correct management of waste material. All of these generated documents, and some of those documents survive. And in them, the gong farmer appears as a named party with rights and obligations and professional existence that the broader social record tends to elide. Richard the Raker, however, appears in the historical record for a different reason. The year was 1326. London. Richard was a raker, the term used, roughly interchangeably with gong farmer, for those who cleaned cesspits and removed waste material from privies. He was working on a night in that year, as rakers worked, in the nighttime hours the ordinance allowed. The cesspit he was working in had developed a structural weakness in its boarding, the wooden planks that covered the access opening having been subjected to years of precisely the environmental conditions most hostile to the longevity of wood. The boards gave way. Richard the Raker fell through. He drowned. The word drowned is, in this context, doing considerable work in describing a death that contemporary accounts describe with more specificity than our bedtime narrative framework easily accommodates, and we will honor the spirit of the occasion by declining to elaborate further and confirming only that yes, Richard the Raker's end was precisely what it sounds like, and that it represented the absolute worst professional outcome available to someone in his trade. He has become, improbably, the most famous gong farmer in the historical record. He is cited in histories of medieval sanitation with consistency that suggests medieval historians, who are generally a measured lot, find this particular incident as vivid as everyone else does. He is also, if you look at him from sufficient distance, a dark kind of monument, not to failure, exactly, but to the hazards of a job that nobody else was willing to do, and to the specific ways that those hazards materialized. The risks of the work were real and were known. Asphyxiation from methane and other gases produced by decomposition in an enclosed space was a genuine danger, and experienced gong farmers tested for it before descending, lowering a candle first and watching whether the flame survived. A candle that went out was a candle telling you something important and urging you to listen. The risk of structural failure, as Richard's case made catastrophically clear, was also real. The risk of being overcome by the combination of confined space and atmospheric conditions was real. These were not abstract hazards. They were specifically feared, specifically managed with available means, and occasionally terribly realized. You were careful. You were always careful. The professional memory of what happened to those who weren't was maintained in exactly the way professional memories of cautionary examples always are, vividly, with full details, and with the explicit understanding that this was a story you did not want to become. By somewhere around 2 a.m, the cart was full from the night's first jobs. The second trip to the lay stall was necessary. The lay stall, from Middle English, a place where things are deposited, was the medieval city solution to the question of where the material went once collected. Not a final solution in any modern sense, because the material did not stop being material when it arrived there. Rather, a transfer point, a designated accumulation space outside the city walls where gong farmers could deliver their loads and where material could wait for its next destination. That destination was, in most cases, the countryside. The use of human waste as agricultural fertilizer was ancient practice, empirically established long before anyone understood the chemistry involved. Medieval farmers who fertilized their fields with night soil produced better crops. They had understood this across generations, perhaps across centuries, through direct observation and the inheritance of agricultural knowledge. They did not understand why, in the terms we would use today. They did not understand nitrogen cycles or phosphorus availability or the biology of soil fertility. They knew the results, and the results were consistent. This created a commercial relationship between the city and its surrounding agricultural hinterland. The lay stalls filled. Farmers from the market gardens and field systems surrounding the city came to collect the material, either paying the lay stall operators for it or receiving it against some other arrangement. The market gardeners who supplied London with vegetables, the intensive small farm operations on the city's immediate periphery, were particularly dependent on the supply of night soil for maintaining soil fertility under the constant cropping pressure of intensive production. The loop was fundamental and closed. The city ate food grown in enriched soil. The enrichment came from the city's own waste. The Gong Farmer was a mechanism that kept the loop functioning, carrying material from the urban end to the agricultural end in the literal middle of the night hours that the city's other inhabitants were sleeping through. You unloaded the cart at the lay stall at about 2:30 in the morning. The lay stall keeper, a man you'd known by sight and name for years, someone who occupied a similarly liminal social position in the city's geography, took the delivery with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom this was completely ordinary professional moment, which for both of you it was. The horse, relieved of its load, moved with noticeably more interest on the return journey. Animals had opinions about the weight they were pulling, and this horse expressed its opinions through the medium of pace and willingness. There were more jobs before dawn. We should talk directly about getting sick, because one of the persistent questions about medieval gong farmers, the question that modern observers most naturally arrive at when they understand what the work involved, is what happened to these people's health? Given the extraordinary nature of their occupational exposure, how did they survive? How did any of them survive long enough to build businesses, raise families, and die in their beds rather than in their pits? The honest answer involves several layers. Medieval cesspits, from a microbial standpoint, were ecosystems of considerable diversity. Human waste contains the shed cells and biological material of the intestinal tract, partially digested food material, and the shed stages of intestinal parasites, eggs, larvae, cysts, as well as bacteria associated with gastrointestinal infections, including the pathogens responsible for typhoid, cholera-like illnesses, and various forms of dysentery. Archaeological analysis of cesspit material from medieval sites has identified eggs and remains of roundworms, whipworms, liver flukes, fish tapeworms, and multiple other parasite species that were endemic in the medieval population generally. A gong farmer working through a cesspit was, therefore, encountering an extremely concentrated sample of every pathogen circulating through the population of whoever had used that privy. The exposure was real. The risk was real. And yet, the trade continued. Individual gong farmers survived to employ multiple workers. Families transmitted the occupation across generations, which implies that at least some members of those families survived long enough to do the transmitting. Something about the reality of the occupational exposure, as extreme as it was, did not immediately and universally kill everyone who engaged in it. The best explanation involves several factors operating together. Acquired immune tolerance. The principle that regular exposure to certain pathogens can produce some degree of immunological adaptation over time is a real phenomenon. It is not reliable, it is not the same as vaccination, and it does not eliminate risk. But long-term gong farmers have been regularly exposed to the dominant local pathogen pool since the start of their careers, and the immune system's response to that repeated exposure may have conferred some partial protection. Practical habits developed through experience, washing after work, managing hand-to-mouth exposure, using equipment to maintain physical distance from the worst of what they were working with, reduced transmission risk in ways that medieval workers understood empirically without having any mechanistic framework for understanding them. Wash your hands after working in the cesspit was actionable advice that produced real benefits whether or not the person following it knew what a bacterium was. And then there's the broader point uncomfortable but historically accurate. Medieval England was an extremely pathogen-rich environment by any modern standard. Intestinal parasite infections were very nearly universal in the urban population. Gastrointestinal illness was a routine feature of life that most people experienced regularly, and that killed some of them, particularly the very young and the very old. In this context, the additional exposure burden carried by gong farmers may have been quantitatively significant, but not qualitatively categorical. A difference of degree from what everyone around them was already experiencing, rather than a completely different category of risk. Medieval medicine, operating within the framework of miasma theory and humoral medicine, understood gong farmers to be especially exposed to corrupt air and therefore especially susceptible to the diseases that corrupt air supposedly caused. The therapeutic response to this included fumigation, burning aromatic herbs and other materials to counteract the miasma, and washing and airing of clothing and person after work. The fumigation addressed the smell rather than the pathogen, and was therefore ineffective in the ways that matter mechanistically, but that no one in the 14th century had a conceptual framework to identify. The washing advice was better, in ways that worked regardless of the theoretical framework used to justify it. Gong farmers fumigated their clothing and sometimes their work areas with burning juniper, sulfur, or other aromatic materials after work. Whether they did this primarily out of belief in miasma theory, or primarily because it reduced the smell to something more tolerable, or some combination of both, is difficult to reconstruct from the historical record. The practical outcome was the same either way. Somewhat less smell, some limited reduction of direct pathogen exposure during the process, and an artifact in the historical record of a professional community that understood, at least empirically, that something needed to be done after the work was done. The Black Death of 1348 to 1353 arrived in England in the late summer of 1348 and moved through the country with speed and lethality that contemporary accounts and modern historical scholarship both struggle to adequately convey. The best current estimates suggest that between 30 and 60% of England's population died in the initial outbreak, with continuing mortality in subsequent waves through the 1360s and beyond. Gong farmers were not spared. The plague did not select for or against any occupation with the specificity that some medieval observers believed. The miasma theory of disease, which attributed plague to corrupt air, led some contemporaries to believe that those already living close to foul air would be protected or alternatively more vulnerable, depending on who was doing the theorizing. Neither turned out to be reliably correct. But the aftermath of the Black Death created labor market conditions that affected gong farmers in particular ways. With the population reduced by a third to a half, there were fewer people producing waste, but there were also dramatically fewer workers of any kind available to do any work. The post-plague labor shortage drove wages upward across essentially all manual trades. For gong farmers, who were already operating in a market where supply of willing workers was severely limited even before the plague, this meant even greater ability to command higher prices. The surviving gong farmers working in a half-empty London found themselves in the economically peculiar position of being both doing necessary work in a city desperate for workers and able to set their own terms more firmly than had previously been possible. History's irony is sometimes very dark. Tonight, in your specific year 1340, 8 years before all of that, the city is at its fullest and the work is at its most established. The pits are full. The clients are waiting. The night is ongoing. Your back has been telling you about itself since the 5th hour of work, in a particular way that several years of the specific kind of physical labor communicates with the body that does it. The lower back, the shoulders, the specific muscles involved in the shoveling motion repeated hundreds of times. These are the places where the work keeps its accounts, and the accounts are presented at approximately this hour of every working night with considerable consistency. You've developed responses to this over the years. Particular stretches in the break between jobs. A specific way of standing upright and rolling the shoulders back that provides brief relief. You don't think of these as practices. They are just things you do. Your hands are callous in specific places, heavy with a particular strength that develops from years of this particular work. They were capable things. Useful in ways that hands need to be useful in a world where most of what you produce was produced by the direct application of your hands to the physical world. There was nothing wrong with working hands. The gong farmer did not live only in the dark. There were the daytime hours, between the end of the working night and the eventual return to it. Hours that were, in comparison to nocturnal intensity of the work, relatively ordinary. Hours in which the ordinary business of daily life in the medieval city could be conducted. The tavern was a central institution of medieval male sociability at most social levels, and the gong farmer who had washed, changed his clothes, and arrived at the tavern in the mid-morning was, visually, indistinguishable from any other working man of similar economic standing. The occupational identifier that the nighttime hours maintained was absent during the day, or at least less immediately present. He was a man who had money, who had time, who wanted ale and perhaps some conversation. He drank. He played dice if he was a gambler. Dice gambling was universal in medieval taverns and universally condemned in varying degrees by the church and officially disapproved by the city, which managed to coincide entirely with the dice gambling continuing without interruption. He talked about the things that men in taverns talked about in any century: the price of things, the behavior of people in positions of authority, the weather, the gossip of the neighborhood, the news that had arrived with the last traveler from somewhere else. Medieval cities offered their residents entertainment that was, by modern standards, both more communal and more viscerally immediate than what we're used to. Saints' Day celebrations, and the medieval calendar was rich with them. Feast days running through the year and marking both religious observance and community gathering were genuine public events with processions, music performed in the streets, outdoor plays and pageants, and the general license permission to be festive that the church provided and mostly supervised. Celebrations were shared experiences in a way that private entertainment technology has made less common. The mystery plays, dramatic performances of biblical stories and saints' lives, mounted on wagons and performed in sequences through the city streets, were major productions in the larger English cities. The York Cycle, the Chester Plays, the Wakefield Mystery Plays. These were elaborate multi-play productions organized by trade guilds and performed for public audiences. They were theatrical in ambition and communal in execution, involving large numbers of people as performers, organizers, and audience, and they were genuinely popular entertainment in the root sense. Entertainment of the people, made by the people for the people. Did gong farmers watch them? Almost certainly. The mystery plays were public events, not admission-restricted entertainments, and the streets that the wagons moved through were streets that anyone could stand in. Did they participate in the guild-organized productions? The Gong Farmers Guild structure is not as well documented as the more prominent craft guilds, which says something about the documentation priorities of medieval record keepers. But some form of professional association likely existed. Archery practice was legally mandated for men of fighting age through much of medieval England. Medieval football, extremely loosely regulated, played between however many players showed up, across whatever distance of town or open ground was agreed, with a kind of cheerful indifference to outcomes that would give a modern sports administrator chest pains, was widely played. Wrestling, running, and various other forms of physical competition that required no equipment beyond willing participants occupied the leisure hours of working men across the social spectrum. And then there was the parish, the community of the parish church. The people baptized, married, and buried in the same building, in the same churchyard, across the same generations, was a foundational social unit of medieval urban life. The network within which mutual aid and obligation and shared identity were maintained. You were known in your parish. Your children were known. Your position in the community, whatever the broader city thought of your occupation, was a known and acknowledged position within that smaller, closer world. There was something important in being known. Most gong farmers are invisible to history. This is a fundamental historical reality that sits at the center of this entire evening, and it is worth stating plainly. Most of the people who did this work across 2 or 3 centuries of English urban life left no individual record. Their names are gone. Their specific stories, the shape of their marriages, the number of their children who survived, the particular clients they served, and the particular pits they worked, and the specific knowledge they accumulated and eventually passed on. All of this is absent from the written record. The historical record was kept by clerks, by monks and scribes, by royal officials and ecclesiastical administrators, by the people whose job was to record the things that the powers of the age determined were worth recording. Gong farmers did not feature prominently in the categories of things worth recording. They appeared occasionally at the margins, a payment entry in a household account, a defendant in a civil dispute over fees, a witness in a case involving something seen during nocturnal rounds, a brief entry in a city ordinance specifying what they were and were not permitted to do. Richard the Raker got a historical mention for the worst possible reason. Some payment records in Westminster Abbey's accounts mention gong farmers without naming them as individuals. London court records include a handful of cases involving gong farmers in property or payment disputes that have accidentally preserved the fact of their existence alongside the specifics of the dispute. Some individual records almost emerge from this background. There is evidence of gong farmers who accumulated property, who employed workers, who had climbed a sufficient standing to generate payment records that survive. There are traces of people who were successful enough in the trade to leave at their deaths, estates that required legal documentation, the kind of documentation that mentions a trade in passing while recording the property. The name Thomas of Pudding Lane is a composite, a historian's construction, a way of gesture at the real person who is almost there in the records but not quite. A gong farmer who became prosperous enough to buy property, who apprenticed a son into a more prestigious trade, who died leaving an estate worth inventorying, who lived a full life that the historical record can almost see but cannot quite resolve into the specific individual it wants to be. He was there. Someone like him was definitely there. The absence of his name is the absence of a record-keeping priority, not the absence of life. The working night moved toward its end. By 4 a.m, you were on the third or fourth job of the night, depending on how the earlier work had gone. The card had been to the lay stall twice. Your tools were showing the wear of several hours' use. Your companions moved with a particular economy of people working the later hours of night's work, not slow but precise, with no unnecessary motion, conserving what was left. The city around you was shifting from its deep night silence toward the first sounds of early morning. The bakers, who had been at their work since the early hours, had ovens at full heat now, and the smell of baking bread moved through the lanes in the pre-dawn stillness with the cheerful authority of something that did not care what else the city smelled of. You had noticed this smell on every working night of the last decade. You would notice it for however many working nights remained. It was a reliable thing. Reliable things mattered. By 4:30, there were sounds of the waking city at its margins. A shutter opening above a lane, someone drawing water from a conduit, the sound of it carrying cleanly in the still air, the cattle pens at the edge of the market beginning to register the presence of the drovers who would move the animals to the slaughter in the morning, a child voice somewhere, crying and then stopping. The ordinance said work must end by 5. You're going to make it with time to spare tonight, which was satisfying the small, specific way that arriving before a deadline is satisfied when the deadline is, or else you get fined 2 shillings. You met your companions at the cart. A few words. The accounting of the night's work, which jobs, which pits, how the material had moved, how the cart had loaded. Not elaborate discussion, but the working summary of men who understood each other's professional language without needing much of it. The jobs had been straightforward. The work had gone well. The night had produced what was supposed to produce. The farewell at the parting of routes was minimal. A nod, a brief word. You'd see each other the next night or the one after. There was no ceremony to the close of a gong farmer's working night. You did the work, you finished the work, and you went home, and tomorrow night you would do it again. The streets on the walk home were the streets of a city waking up, which was a different texture from the streets of a city go to sleep, and different again from the streets of a city in its deepest dark. There was movement now. The first few people, the earliest risers with their own schedules and reasons. None of them needed to look at you. You moved through the waking city with the ease of long practice, taking the routes that avoided the main arteries, moving toward home. A neighbor's shutter opened above you as you turned onto your lane. You didn't look up. The shutter closed again. Your door. Inside. The warmth of the banked fire and particular combined smell of your household. Your people, your life. Your wife was up, as she always was when you returned, and the porridge was on the fire, and the room was lit by the rushlight on the table, and your daughter was still asleep in her corner with the absolute commitment of a small child who has decided that morning has not yet arrived regardless of what the light might suggest. You washed. This was not optional. The washing after work was as automatic as putting down your tools, hands and arms and face, as thoroughly as the available water allowed, with the practical vigor of someone who had long since stopped needing to think about why this was the right habit. The water went dark quickly. You changed your clothes. Clean clothes were an arrival. Every morning they were an arrival. You sat down at the table, and your wife set the bowl in front of you, and the porridge was hot, and the morning was coming, and the city outside was stepping into another day. Let us move gently forward in time. Forward past the working years, past the accumulated seasons, past the specific nights, and the particular pits, and the familiar route to the lay stall. Forward to the end of a gong farmer's working life, and then to the end of the life itself. Medieval life expectancy, when discussed, is usually presented in the form of an average that conceals as much as it reveals. The average was low, pulled dramatically downward by child mortality that was catastrophic by any modern measure. A child in 14th century England had perhaps a 40 to 50% chance of surviving to adulthood, depending on the city, the year, the family's economic circumstances, and the specific disease environment of the location. Children who survived past 5 or 6 had substantially improved prospects. Adults who reached their mid-20s might reasonably expect to reach their 40s or 50s. And people in their 60s and 70s appear with enough regularity in the historical record that their presence there is not remarkable. A gong farmer who survived the hazards of the work, who was careful, who had developed good practical habits, who was fortunate in the great lottery of medieval disease, who did not encounter a Richard the Raker situation, might work for 30 or 40 years. Longer if the body held. The work was physically demanding, and the body would begin, at some point, to express its own opinions about what it could still do and what it could no longer do reliably. By the later working years, the arrangement might shift, an experienced gong farmer managing the business side, contracts, clients, logistics, the knowledge of which pits and which properties needed attention, and when, while younger workers handled the physical execution. This was a natural progression of a family trade. Knowledge was worth something. The network of client relationships accumulated over decades was worth something. The specific expertise of knowing the city's underground geography, which properties had which kinds of pits, which had structural concerns, which clients paid promptly and which needed following up, was worth something. The gong farmer who worked for 30 years had something to offer that no amount of physical strength in a younger worker could substitute for. The deathbed was, in medieval England, a ritual space. The church had spent centuries developing the apparatus of a good Christian death, the gathering of family and priest, the final confession, the administration of extreme unction, the anointing with blessed oil that prepared the dying body for what the church understood to follow. This was not optional ceremony. It was a threshold crossing that the community's religious framework had choreographed carefully, and failing to cross it properly, dying unconfessed, unanointed, without the rites, was a source of serious anxiety for the dying and the bereaved alike. The gong farmer received these rites. No occupation excluded a person from the final sacraments of the church. The same priest who had baptized the children, who had heard the confessions, who had said Mass on Sunday, he came to the bedside at the end. He said the prayers. He applied the oil. He commended the soul with the same words he used for anyone else. The burial was in the churchyard, wrapped in a plain shroud, committed to the ground with prayer, in the consecrated soil of the parish that had been the community's ground for generations. A grave marker, perhaps a wooden cross, or a simple stone if the family could afford it, or nothing permanent that time has preserved. Most medieval graves are marked now by nothing at all. The earth has absorbed them. What remained was the house, the tools, the savings in the chest, if there were savings, the client relationships that might be worth something to whoever continued the trade, the children, alive or not, grown or still growing, the parish record of the burial, written in Latin by the clerk, noting the name and the date and perhaps the trade, surviving in an archive somewhere or not surviving. Some children continued the trade. Some used the economic foundation their parent had built to apprentice into something different, a craft, a trade, a profession with different social valences and different prospects. This was how it worked. The generation that did the difficult work created the conditions for the next generation to do something else, if the next generation chose, and if the economics allowed. This is the invisible mechanism of social mobility in any era, the foundation laid by people whose names history does not keep, that allows the people history does keep to stand where they stand. Medieval England is fading now. The smell is receding. That extraordinary, impossible, layered smell that we have been living inside for this entire evening, that no perfumery could reproduce and no one will want to. The sounds of the city at night are fading too. The creak of the cart on cobblestones, the patient breath of the horse, the rhythmic sound of bucket and shovel and rope working in the dark, the slow drip of water in a stone channel, the distant and continuous noise of the city being itself while it sleeps. What remains as you settle deeper into wherever you are tonight is something less specific and more durable, a sense of a life, fully lived in conditions that would have broken most of what we consider comfortable, a sense of particular kind of competence and resilience that a medieval gong farmer built through years of doing necessary, difficult, unglamorous work with skill and consistency, a sense of the world they moved through, the dark city, the cold streets, the small light of a lantern cutting through the medieval dark, and of the people who loved them and depended on them, and woke up in the morning to bread and warmed in part because of what happened in the night. History is enormously good at remembering the people at the top of its hierarchies. The kings and the bishops and the great lords and the celebrated scholars and the saints with their miracles and their relics. These are the people the record keepers recorded. These are the people whose stories fill the museums and the textbooks and the popular histories. But the city needs cleaning. The cesspits need emptying. The farms need fertilizing. The loop between the city's consumption and the countryside's production needs someone to manage it through the dark hours when nobody is watching. Someone did that work for centuries in every major city of medieval England and the wider medieval world. In London and York and Norwich and Bristol, in Paris and Bruges and Cologne, in the great cities of Italy and Iberia, and wherever else human beings lived in sufficient density to make the problem unavoidable. Someone did it every night, without exception, across the entire span of the medieval period. They were not heroic in the literary sense. They did not fight battles or write books or build cathedrals or make pilgrimages to sacred sites. They carried buckets. They descended into underground chambers by rope in the dark. They hauled the accumulated biological reality of the city through sleeping streets to the edge of the world and delivered it to farmers who turned it back into food. And because of this, the city continued. It is a strange kind of heroism. It smells strongly and it worked at night, and it has left almost no individual record. But it kept the machine of urban civilization running with the same fidelity and the same essential necessity as any achievement the history books do remember. The Gong Farmer was there. Let the record, however small and however late, note this. So settle back now. The medieval night is over. The working hours are done. In some small house on some lane in some medieval city, a man or a woman is sitting down to a bowl of porridge by a fire, having washed the night off their hands, having changed into clothes that belong to the other life, the daytime life, the domestic life, the life that the occupation funds and protects. Outside the door, the city is waking up. The bells are beginning their round of the hours, 5, 6, in the old way, the way they have been marking time in English towns for centuries and will continue to mark time for centuries more. The light is changing. The baker's bread is ready. The market is setting up its stalls. And underground, beneath all of it, the clean emptied cesspits sit in their lined chambers, smelling of themselves, beginning already the slow work of filling again. The world is what it is. The work goes on. But for now, the night is done. The work is finished. The lamp is out. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the 14th century dissolve back into wherever the past lives when it's not being visited. You are here, in your own century, in your own room, with the way your own blanket and the sounds of your own world settling around you. You are comfortable in a way that almost no one in the 14th century was comfortable. You have warmth and light, and a ceiling that is not made of thatch, and water that comes from a tap, and food that has not been questioned, and medical knowledge that would seem miraculous to every person you have spent this evening with. History gave you this. The slow, imperfect, grinding forward movement of human civilization, built on the accumulated labor of 10,000 generations of people who did the work that needed doing, all of it, including the unglamorous work, especially the unglamorous work, gave you this. Think of that briefly if you'd like to, then let it go. Sleep well. Thank you for being here tonight. If you enjoyed spending the dark hours in medieval London's less celebrated streets, please do like the video. It genuinely helps more people find this place. And if you like more of this, more quiet evenings with forgotten history, the subscribe button is there and it will be genuinely appreciated. More history is waiting. More nights are coming. The lantern is out. The street is quiet. Sleep.